Hello, and welcome to the Mik One podcast, where I sit down with industry leaders to discuss the project to product movement. I'm Mik Kirsten, founder and CEO of TaskTop and best-selling author of Project to Product, How to Survive and Thrive in the Age of Digital Disruption with the Flow Framework. I am thrilled to have Jean-Michel Lemieux join us on today's episode. Jean-Michel is an author, investor, and advisor, and former CTO and SVP of engineering at Shopify. He has been working in tech for 27 years, initially building software and then building teams and companies. He was a founding member on the Eclipse platform and open source team, and then led the engineering organizations at Atlassian and Shopify. I have found Jean-Michel's wisdom to be second to none, and I have learned so much from him over the years. So I'm just thrilled that he could join us today to talk engineering, architecture, scale, organizational design, and flow. So with that, let's get started. Jean-Michel, welcome to the Project to Product podcast. It is so great to see you after all these years of us having had a chance to work together, sometimes in parallel universes. How are you doing?
Great to be here, Mik. Yeah, I think it's been 20 years that we've known each other and haven't hung out like this. So thanks for inviting me, and great idea.
Yeah, no, I was reflecting on it, and I think I probably spent 2 years getting to know you entirely through your code before I ever saw your face. I ever saw you in person, and it was all of that code in Eclipse itself, where I think as you remember, I was trying to make your code do things as it wasn't exactly meant to do. While I already, there was so much beauty and elegance to what you created there. It was probably some of the most extensible and cleanest code I saw in all of Eclipse, and across those 60 million lines or whatever it was at that point. And as I was trying to implement, as you remember, Mile and the aspect-oriented programming stuff and everything else. So just tell us a bit about how your journey with software started.
Yeah, well, that's a great story. I mean, I do remember probably through Bigzilla as much as in code, because I think in the early days of Eclipse, as we scaled and opened up and open sourced, I remember one of the interesting things, maybe a bit of a tangent to start our conversation, but as a software developer, you spend so much time trying to make things work. You're like, man, like you're in school, you're like, oh man, I've got to make the search algorithm work. You got to make things work. And then I think a really big lesson around Eclipse was interesting is when you build software with others, a lot of time it's just figuring out like how do you communicate. So I think we spent 60% of our time in Eclipse once we open sourced it in Bugzilla talking with people. I remember your team and you were doing something really interesting where you were trying to use our APIs in ways we hadn't imagined. And I think that's why I was so fascinated with what you're doing with Mylan, and I think wasn't it called Mylar at some point?
It was, but then the Eclipse Foundation realized there was a trademark issue with DuPont.
Because I love Mylar was great. Anyway, and I think my fascination with what you guys were doing back then was I always like people doing crazy things with their software, and you guys you're probably one of the craziest in terms of just trying to do things that were like we actually didn't know how to do it, right? And I think that's why we ended up hanging out a lot back then.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it was amazing trying to exactly change the interaction model to actually be more around the collaboration around those Bugzilla bugs, right? Those tasks, and connecting that up to code.
And I think for those who don't know what you were trying to do with Eclipse, so Eclipse, IDE platform was you're like when you're working on code, you should have a lens onto your code that gives you context awareness into the tasks you're doing, not just into the global, right? Because I think people get overwhelmed when you're coding with just having too much cruft around you. And then, so basically, if you think about what Mik was doing with Mylan was, hey, can I apply a filter on every part of Eclipse that I can change on demand? And for that, I think it was a great idea. I think you were probably onto something. I think we just don't know how to implement it yet. So, but anyway, that was a long time ago. But it was fascinating. Anyway, that's where Mik and I met. In Bugzilla and in Java development 20 years ago.
Yeah, and all our collaboration was through those Bugzilla bugs, right? So what today are Jira issues and other issue tracking issues for people. That's where I think it was probably a couple of years of collaborating through that before we actually met face to face at a conference. So.
Exactly.
And it did definitely. I mean, for me, it was super interesting because I think at the same time, we were very focused on understanding software architecture. You and Jeff McCaffer, I read your book at the time. I thought, wow, like this is how you build these extensible platforms, right? Some of the extensibility back then that the two of you created as I think a lot better than some of the frameworks we see today. And it really established some of those foundations on extensibility, on modularity, on components. So having be reusable. I think that the really interesting thing to me at that time was it was not just about the code, right? How much we were actually collaborating and how much in what we now call value streams had to do with that flow of work, that collaboration through the issues, through those back then Bugzilla bugs, how that was a sort of a first class structure. And I think we've seen a lot of that, right? Because after Eclipse, your work took you actually, it was Rational and IBM, but then to Atlassian, where you were very much working on defining how issue tracking and how that collaboration across teams works, not just at the level of the code, which a lot of us grew up around, but actually at that level of collaboration. So tell us a bit about that. What you learned through your days of Eclipse and IBM, but then actually what took you to Atlassian, to becoming the VP of engineering at Atlassian?
Yeah. So I think maybe just back up a bit. So, I had a pretty, I guess, boring, kind of entry into software development, went to university, told my parents I'm going to computer science because my guidance counselor told me to, and I didn't have any better ideas at the time. And, back then, like my parents knew no one who had was a software developer. Like they didn't exist, right? So they were like, okay, I guess, wrote software for a while. And I think in the early, I could say early days, but it's not like we're that old. We're like, we're 50 now. It was actually really interesting software we were building, and maybe there was a bit of a luck, but, graduated university. And then in like 93 to 96 was both the invention of the internet, but also more importantly was the invention of telephony as we know it, right? The digitization of the telephone networks was probably like the first place that I guess modern software was being deployed and people were paying for it. There was a bit of an arms race to digitizing the phone networks. And if you think about the kinds of software you need to run in phone networks, it's actually pretty complex, real-time systems, distributed, like I'd say I'm going to use the word cloud now, but there's computers so like right out of school, I was using, everything I learned, right? Like distributed system, TCP/IP, non-blocking sockets, doing fraud detection on phone networks, because as soon as they were rolling out new technology, it reminds me a bit of crypto today. Like first thing that happens is people.
You were doing fraud. I didn't know you were doing fraud detection too. Wow.
We're doing fraud detection. We're basically doing, because people were doing like reverse call collect, like fraud. And
right.
So because it was just, everyone was imagining software, like just enabling all these new use cases. The problem is you enable them and you just don't know all the back doors you left open, right? So there was a bit of it was just a fascinating time. And also like the phone networks were busy, so the software you're deploying right away, you're getting millions of phone calls. Like anyway, for me, it was like, just, the net, it was like really, really interesting software to write. I found it like intimidating. Like it was like, I was in Bell Canada's like central office at, I had between 12 and 4 a.m. to upgrade our software. Like that was what it was like. And it was like fascinating. Maybe I got lucky. People don't talk about, people talk about Netscape and web browsers and Microsoft, but a lot of us who were building out, I guess, more of the telephony space. It was, just really, really fun software. I'll get to why that helps Shopify because it does. There's a connection to Shopify later. But so I guess a bit boring writing software, doing that. And then, I think because of the kinds of software we're writing in the telephony space, it was complex. And I think we, at the time, in Ottawa, like Nortel and BNR, we're always searching for different, there must be a better way to write software because it was hard. Like it took a lot of time, a lot of money, and we weren't that good at it, so it was pretty buggy. And this was mission critical software. This was not a social network where, if you have too many likes, you just stop accepting likes. Like these were phone calls. So I think there was a bunch of really interesting spin-offs that came out of the telephone industry around how to write better software. And one of those was in Ottawa called Object Time. Yeah. And I don't know if anyone remembers Object Time. We were a small startup of about 100 people, and Rational Software ended up buying us. So that's kind of how I got into I'd say almost the software methodology space of Rational buying this startup in Ottawa, because we came up with it was like kind of real-time, it was called real-time object-oriented modeling, which is a way of defining real-time systems and modularity, encapsulation, and just making it easier for you to build distributed systems, which was, again, the hard part in telecom. We got bought by Rational, and then you get sucked into just thinking about how to build software a lot, So I think it was a really, in some ways, boring, but also interesting of just writing software and then being bought by a company, Rational Software, who was supposed to be a bit of the teacher of how to write good software, and then ran a bit of time in there, and then Eclipse kind of was a really natural evolution to okay, we've been doing this for a while. Let's help developers write software. So that's kind of how I got into Eclipse, having, I guess, written a lot of software, knowing how hard it is, and I think trying to make it, trying to maybe advance, the space of just making it easy to write software. That's up to Eclipse. And then, you're with me with Eclipse, which was both humbling because I guess for the first time we wrote a platform that was open, and we built a community around it. And I think that was, really good, but it was really good software. We had really good principles, and I think that was fun. And I think you participated in that. And I think after that, at some point I was like, I always found with Eclipse that we could have created our own company. Like we could have spun out, had a amazing, built a $1 billion business out of this. Cause I think it was probably one of the funnest teams I've been a part. And I think me going to Atlassian I was like, I'd love to build great software and be in a business. Like, how do I do both together? So I think going from a bit academia of software and open source, I was like, how do I build a business? And then for me, that was my next chapter of like, it looks like it's really hard. And all the telecom companies that I grew up with, BlackBerry, Nortel, they'd all died because of other things. And for me, it was there's a curiosity of going, man, it feels really hard to build companies. Yeah. And so from software to building companies is kind of that transition of why I ended up at Atlassian.
Well, I actually think we would have been better off if you had spun out a company like that. And it was back then, OTI, Object Technology International, was doing this for a while around Smalltalk as well, right? But if we'd had that for the Java ecosystem, I think fundamentally we'd have better tooling today. But I guess notably what you started seeing, actually what Rassel even was seeing, is that the way that we manage work, the way that we track work, all this issue tracking was becoming a really important business model and then system of record in its own right. So spent all this time coding and learning about these issues of scale. I'm sure we'll get back to when you talk more about Shopify. Then helping others code and building this extensible platform. And then tell us more about how then that shifted into moving to Atlassian.
I think I was it's not that I knew how to write code, but I think one of the interesting things around Eclipse is, I became a manager. We built some other, technologies, and having seen businesses die around me, I was like, the combination of building great software and building great teams together, I think is like the hardest thing to do, right? And how I think the best companies end up flourishing and the best communities end up flourishing is those who can do both. So Atlassian was a company that I think we're kind of competing against a bit, like they were basically our competitors to, Rational, who had been the big developer tool company out there, right, with bug tracking and version control and all that. And I saw these two young dynamic, guys in Australia doing it. So it was November 12th. I still remember it. I was having dinner with my wife and I said, I'm going to send an email tonight that could change our lives. I'm going to send an email to Mike and Scott, who are the CEOs of Atlassian, and say that I think I can help them out. And, it might turn out, do you want to move to Australia? And she's like, yeah, whatever. Just anyway, she thought I was joking. I sent the email out and, before you know it, we were moved the kids to Australia and was leading the engineering team at Atlassian and way over my head.
I remember those days. So tell us. It'd be great to hear more about that. How did it start? What were sort of the main things that you were trying to achieve at the start? And how did you get in over your head?
One of the things that I'd not appreciated as much about the Eclipse team was that we kind of grew up together. We went from a small team to a bigger team, and I think when that happens, you end up having these super high bandwidth conversations with your peers, because you have this shared context of just so many learned experiences that, like, you don't write them down, but you build this shared context that's like so valuable. I land in a new continent, a new company, like the tech stack, I kind of like, it was OSGI and Java, but it's more around the people, the culture, the history. And next thing you know, I'm like, why can't people read my mind? Like my old team, and I say that in a good way. Like we'd read each other's minds, like we'd fully, finish each other's phrases. And I think landing in a new company where I don't have that context and they don't have the context on me was like, honestly, it might sound really simple, but it was like, it threw me for a loop for like the first year of going, holy shit, I've got to build all this up again, right? Build trust, build context on technology, build context on culture before I can get back to having these high bandwidth conversations that I just left because I'd worked with the same team for 10 plus years.
Right. So that's so interesting, right? Because you knew the tech stack. I'm sure you got your head around the architecture really quickly. So it really was the team structure and dynamics and leadership.
Absolutely. And I'd say that the culture around the company, like just like what have they been talking about that I wasn't privy to? What decisions have they made that I haven't been privy to? And how do they work? And when I showed up at Atlassian, I think, one of the biggest projects that was ongoing that had just started was moving to the cloud.
Yeah.
So this is 2010, moving to the cloud. How do we do that, right? And that was just obviously fascinating. Back then, I think was a really good decision, which is you can either change your entire tech stack or you can put VMs in the cloud in a very efficient way. And I think at that time we decided to put VMs in the cloud very efficiently.
What was it? Racks, just VMs running on Rackspace, single tenant back then when you started?
Yeah, it was single tenant. I forget what was... there was kind of like these micro VMs. It wasn't VMware, and it was like our own kind of managed VMs that we could run and spin up. And actually, it was a small colo provider that we were partners with. It wasn't even Rackspace. And yeah, we'd spin up single tenant instances for probably, we did that for like 5-6 years.
Wow. I know some companies still doing that today. But
well, I mean, it's fascinating because I think let's go to cloud software, because Atlassian was probably in some ways a bit of an introduction to me, because we've been writing software, but not in the cloud shape as much, but you have to write software very differently, right? To be multi-tenanted and all that fun stuff. And I think the entire planet now has, we wrote software in a way that wasn't, it wasn't cloud native. And I think AWS has been really good, and they realized really early that people moving to the cloud aren't just moving, like it's not moving, it's basically rebuilding their platform.
Yeah.
Right. And helping people do that is extremely valuable. I think at Atlassian, a mistake I probably made was delaying that architectural change. I think we were in scrappy, this is pre-IPO, like way pre-IPO of Atlassian. Yeah. And we're like, let's get this thing running. Hard to say if it was a good call or not, but I think, if I had to go back in time, with a time machine, I think we should have taken one or two pieces and split them out, like cloud native built them, like not the whole stack, but like, hey, why don't we make search? Okay, like take a feature and go, hey, we could build search in a cloud native way, right? Cross-platform, multi-tenanted. Search really has a good API towards it, right? It's like you take, you can suck the data into it, index it, multi-tenant it, and then bring it out. And, we can even still using Elasticsearch and Lucene, but I think I would have taken a couple of those components and made them multi-tenanted, made them cloud native, have them plug into the single tenant version of Jira or Confluence, whatever we're running. And then I think bring that culture into the team earlier versus I think it took a bit longer to do that. So.
Yeah, and I think when we get back to what you did differently at Shopify, I think let's get back to this topic, because I think that is some of the key learnings. It's great getting these out right now for others to hear, and of course we'll send resources to. I know you've been documenting some of this through Twitter, through this book that you're writing. We'll get back to that, but I'd love to just dig in some more into that, because I think so many people out there are now faced with similar decisions that you were making back then, right? Which is how quickly to move their application portfolios, their workloads to cloud. And I'll just never forget. I remember actually where we were standing when you told me, I'm going to actually fork the code base of Jira and beyond. And I thought this was such a crazy thing for me to hear you say, because and this is many, many years ago now, but all the kind of mutual work we've done were really around extensibility and modularity. And I thought, wow, like that just seems so wasteful for Jean-Michel to be splitting the code base into the cloud code base and the multi-tenant code base. And I feel like for the following years, I actually learned why that was such an important move. And of course, now you've got more approaches where you've done that in a pocket and split out some services like search and gotten that DNA into the operational DNA into the teams and so on.
And that's what the fork actually ended up being, right? Is building some cloud native services and saying we don't have to make them on-prem, right? Just like a lack of a baggage. And I think there's a really good saying, which is, duplication is better than neuronic abstraction.
Right.
And I think that's probably at the core of why the fork was, at that time, was the right step to take, I think, for the long-term architecture of the Atlassian platform.
Yeah, and I think I still see this as being very counterintuitive to so many of the enterprise architects out there, right? Is that duplication is better than neuronic abstraction. Because again, it's based on a lot of what we learned through computer science, through our training or our coding. It just seems wasteful. So take us through that, through how you did that, through what you learned, and maybe what you would do differently.
Well, I wasn't there when it ended. Like I think Atlassian just end of life. I think their server platform, which was the single tenanted version of.
But that, by the way, just blows me away that the decisions you were making 10 years ago actually had impact on news I saw yesterday related to Atlassian stock price and how they're handling the fork of server. Right, so the impact of these architecture decisions and how they're executed have these massive consequences in terms of actually the value, the growth of, and the way that companies can fundamentally support their customers.
I mean, I don't know why it's that surprising. I mean, if you think about it, like as an engineer, you really don't know if you've done a good job until 5 years into the future.
Right.
Which is like, if you're writing the code, is like, did it age well or not? Right. Like basically a lot of like, did it get us closer to where we're trying to go? Like you don't know those right away, right? Like we're building things that are into the future a lot more. So I think that's what's hard being an engineering leader, is you're basically making a bunch of bets, into the future, and you won't know until, for a while. But I think the bet that at Atlassian we were making at the time was a lot of things you're trying to do technically is about improving your velocity of evolution, right? Like software is like, it's almost like a biological system. Like it's not fixed, it evolves. So we're like, what's the quickest way we can evolve this thing? And we'd realize that, as I said, we did VMs, we did single tenant. We tried to evolve it kind of all co-mixed together, and it was too slow. We had to go build some cloud native things, and without the handcuffs of saying we're going to have to build 2 versions of it right away or figure out how to make it work. Like just there was a cultural burden that was away, and it sped up velocity, right? And then So I think that was the crux of it, right? Which I think, and if you think about it, every time you evolve your software, you end up forking something, right? Like at Shopify, like we're going to add a new tax system into it. Well, we keep the existing one, we create the other one in parallel, we route traffic to it for a while, we make it do 20% of the use cases, we test it out, and at some point we merge it back, right? Forking and merging is how we develop software forever. And I think the last one was just a bigger one that we had to talk about publicly, because just managing expectations, and there are customers who are like, why am I not getting features? I think, as part of building a company, I think selling the vision of where you're going ended up being important. Yeah. And I think that's why I think there's a lot of emphasis on it, of just letting people know, Atlassian, we're building for the future, and do you want to, it might be bumpy, but come on the ride with us.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's what's so fascinating about the Atlassian one was it was visible, it was so significant. And the decisions that you made resulted in billions of dollars worth of value being created. And if they'd been made differently, or you'd waited another 3 years or something of that sort, it could be in a very different spot.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people like this was not my decision, really. I mean, it was all of us together, and the founders were like Mike and Scott, really pushing us. Like Mike and Scott, if I learned anything from them, was their incessant questioning of like, could we be better, and what how do we get better all the time? And I think like they made the environment so this could be possible, like make these big bets possible. So
awesome.
And they kept at it, right? My replacement at Atlassian, who actually just left, Shri, we didn't overlap. I think he started a year after, but I know we talked a lot when he joined about keeping that going, and the incessant kind of investment we have to make. And maybe there's a lot of people who aren't in the situation where you have a lot of paying customers. There's a lot of pressure internally to just keep going the way you're going. I think Microsoft's probably a really good example of a platform level change that they waited 20 years too long to make, right? Which is, think about, how does every Microsoft product store files on the file system? Cool. Okay. The cloud doesn't work like that. So, so I think like Microsoft have been rewriting their client server architecture for a while. And I think one of the things that their current CTO told me was, again, their biggest mistake was delaying that a bit too much, right? They had to fork, they had to go, okay, we have to build cloud native again. And cloud native is storage, UI, like how do we do UI, and where do we put the business logic? Like those are the 3 things you always have to think about. And in a very fat client server app, a lot of that was on the client. And we're like, we have to rewrite that. So the conversation I had with the CTO of Microsoft at the time was just very impactful in that, as engineering leaders, we're all in this spot where we're like, how do we evolve our software, and how do we know when it's the right time to make a big fork versus a small fork? And I think there's no answer, but I think, great engineering leaders at any point in time have a bit of a map of going, here's where I could be, looking for a step change, and how to invest in that. So And I think that was I guess that was a lesson from Atlassian that I took into Shopify. And that was very, very high in my mind right now, which is what architectural changes do we have to make? And I think my brain now is very wired to doing them sooner than I would have in the past.
Right. And so I think it's interesting the way you put it, where the CEOs of Atlassian create the environment to empower those changes. I love what you said, that it's the changes were about improving the velocity of your evolution, right? So to me, one of the biggest learnings, and it gets into the flow framework, is we have to architect for that velocity for each value stream, right? We can't create this one single platform that just becomes a dependency on everybody. Is that duplication's okay as long as we're increasing velocity, right? I think it's a lot of what we've seen. One of your colleagues, Jordy Henderson, he and I talked about this on the previous podcast, right? Is just optimizing around that velocity and the velocity of the evolution, how much quickly you can get better, and of course being able to measure that. Are we getting better? So, and I think that fundamentally is what I've seen helping people break through the sort of brick walls they have on never allowing duplication. They're always trying to centralize everything, and again, trying to over-specify things rather than providing that autonomy to each of the value streams to go faster and figuring out how to go faster.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, to that point, there's a bit of a mental model that I forget who I probably influenced by a bunch of people on the internet around this. But to your point of when you're writing software, like what kind of software do you write for what features? Is it do you have to sweat the details of every line of code do you write? Like, how do you decide? And I think the best mental model I've come up with is you have to think about all the projects that you're doing around either it's a platform project, it's a feature project, or an experiment. There's three kinds of things that you're doing generally. And I'm going to take out all the nuances, but just three buckets, right? So the platform work you're doing, I'd say, is 50% of what your roadmap is. And those are things that you've extracted from writing a lot of software, and you've found some primitives, right? You found some shared primitives, you found some abstractions, you found some places to put it in your code where you're going to enable a lot of things into the future. And that's half of your roadmap. And those are things that, again, platform work has to enable new things to happen in the future, right? They have to, I'm adding this concept into our core thingamajiggy that's going to be able to be used in all these different ways. Cool, that's a good investment, right? And that code there has to age really well. But then 40% are features where, duplication is probably fine, right? It's probably time to market that matters. It's probably like the risk there is actually understanding the domain, actually building things that matter, right? Like in commerce, actually building a checkout that's going to be really, that's going to be useful, or building whatever, a loan system, whatever. Those features there, you can't over-engineer them because you don't know enough yet, right? And they're providing value. And then 10% are experiments, which is you better be ready to throw it away. And so I think if you don't identify the kinds of work that you're doing, every piece of software you're going to write is going to look the same, or you're going to put the same effort to, which is not what the value you're getting from the business, right? And I say value from the business, almost I sound like a pointy-haired manager, but every code that you write has a purpose, and it's never the same. And you have to know what your purpose is. And then when you know what your purpose of that software is, then you can apply the right tools to writing it. And I think the biggest mistake I've seen people make is they think all software has the same purpose, so they apply the same tools to every piece of software, and then it creates slowness, frustration, and even the worst thing is you've got different, I'd say, types of engineers who are good at different types of writing software, and they put the wrong people on the wrong software system. So, in a nutshell, I completely agree with what you're saying, and I think you have to recognize that you're writing different software, and then as a team, as a company, kind of give names to those things and have dialogue around what are we writing this for, and then that's going to help you decide how you write it.
Yeah, I think Jean-Michel, what I love, and I think you have documented this on your notion of platform investments, right, in the book that you're writing, and that can be found on your Twitter feeds. I want to make sure people don't miss this. People would be shocked, I think, in terms of a lot of the way that portfolios look today in larger enterprises. The fact that you're saying 50% of your software portfolio, those teams' efforts should be going into these platform parts, right? Where one of the main things that we see, by the way, when we measure companies' value streams, is that there's some notion of greenfields and experiments, and enough people read Lean Startup and they're doing bits and pieces of that, right? So I think that's understood somewhat. The vast majority of where the development is focused, where you've got all the thousands of staffs at these larger companies actually have to do on those feature parts of things, right? And the underinvestment that we see.
The typical distribution is 10% experiments, which I think is people do it because they've read all the books, they're afraid of failing if they don't find the next moonshot or. And then it's 80% features.
Yeah, exactly.
And 10% platform.
That's right.
And then they complain developers leave.
Yep.
Because the platform work actually, a lot of it has to do with making sure the developers can actually write code in your company. And you probably 15% of the platform work is understanding what kind of software you're writing, like build tooling, infrastructure, like all that stuff that developers need to actually write code is completely underinvested in most companies. And so it's an attrition problem. And then the other thing is they don't get any long-term velocity. They get short-term velocity because you learn a lot by building those 80% features, right? You learn about where you're duplicating code, and sometimes it makes sense and sometimes it doesn't. And then you're learning about abstractions that can enable more things. And if you don't go and bring those learnings back, and I think I have a diagram in that chapter of the book around those three types of work, like platform, features, and experiments, have feedback loops between them that are fascinating, right? So the feedback loop between platform, features, and experiments is platform enables more features and features enables more experiments. And then in the inverse, experiments informs the features and the features informs the platform.
Yeah.
So the minute you have an imbalance there, you're and I hate the word debt, but you're just creating like a long-term non-efficient software process, right? Because you're not using the feedback loops and you're not learning and you're not taking those learnings and doing something about it.
Yeah, exactly. I think to your point, the 80% being on features is what we're seeing, and because of course we get to measure all these flows, right? So the two biggest flow dysfunctions that we see across the enterprise customer base that we have is first of all too much load on the teams doing the features because they're always behind, and because they're always. The bottom line is if we actually look at their flow efficiency, where they're blocked. It's from they're waiting on platform components. They're waiting on common views of customer data, common pipelines, anything the cloud services that they needed to layer over that aren't there. The other issues with infrastructure. So I think you kind of nailed it. And I think you speak about it so clearly. Is shifting to that is actually going to make everything go faster and getting to that right kind of balance. And it's a really big difference if you're talking about thousands or tens of thousands of developers. The difference between 50% and 20%.
It's a big number, and I've had to. I guess in the past I did not protect it enough, and now Toby knows. Toby's who's the CEO, who's still the CEO of Shopify. He's a developer, he's an engineer, but he also runs a company, and he would often he'd go, "Hey, those people are working on platform. Can I move them to this?" And I was like, I just wanted to make sure he understood all the things that this is enabling in the future, and so there was always a good you have to kind of and show the value. Like I think you have to run the platform like it's a product as well. Like exactly. It is a product. And I think one of the things I learned as well, just in terms of lessons as an engineering leader in a bigger organization, I always found myself as the head of product for the platform. Mm-hmm. And that meant that I have a responsibility to manage like a product, which is I've learned from product managers that they're really, really good at being organized. And I actually wasn't that organized. And I wasn't that good at measuring kind of outcomes. So in the platform, I'd say our five of the most important features of every product are owned by the platform teams: uptime, scalability, performance, extensibility, and like maintainability almost, right? Like those are the 5 features. So I would make sure I had a product team, within the platform that we're measuring those things at all time and showing those as value and actually showing this to our marketing team going, by the way, you're only looking at that 40% bucket of work to promote as features, but we've got these 5 other features here that have to be inherently built into the platform to be successful, and they're useful. And it's funny because once I actually had to rebring this mindset into Shopify, because I think I ended up on the back seat of just doing what product said. It was just actually no, like I personally own these features now, and it'd be funny, and you do interviews like, what do customers care about? They care about uptime, they care about performance, they care about extensibility, especially in the enterprise, they care that your software can be malleable and molded. And I was like, you have to invest in a bit like Eclipse. This all came from Eclipse. You have to invest in primitives to make your software extensible. And a lot of teams I find, as you said, like if you measure their velocity, you'll see that they're all blocked on learnings of like, if I only had like a workflow engine, man, like that, like, well, then build one. But who builds one? And it's hard to figure out who's going to do that. And and I guess as a CTO, what's great is as a product owner of the platform, it's a fascinating and fun job then to take it with that discipline, right? And take it seriously as not just technical work to keep, to keep things running, but it's actually it's probably some of the most valuable features of your entire business are owned by careful investments in those areas.
Yeah, so this is what I'm finding so fascinating right now. Is that some leadership in these large organizations is recognizing that the digital platforms they're creating are the most important assets, but that's not common. I think you've had the privilege of working for CEOs who were developers, right? Mike and Scott were sick of Bugzilla, and so they re-implemented some of that working style. Toby, as you mentioned, it'd be great if you could just dig in a little bit. And I do want to get back to this point of the platform as product and ownership of that. But how you've effectively made the economic case for how leadership, the executive team, needs to think about these platform investments. You've actually come up with a very prescriptive number, which I agree with. I think it's the same number that Jeff Lawson put in Ask Your Developer in that book, right? He actually said 50%, around 50%. So, and you've successfully made the economic case to the companies that you've worked with to create that kind of investment. So, how did you do that? Is it mostly through the outcomes? Is it mostly through accelerating velocity, accelerating learning, closing the feedback loop? Is there anything more? And for all those people who are now at 10, 15, 20% of platform investment, who are going to listen to this podcast and are going to go talk to their CEOs, any more tips you have for them?
So it's a three-step process. Well, not a three-step process, but I think there's three themes that are going to help you. I hate the word make the argument, but just promote that this is a worthy investment. Like this is like investment like anything else, right? And the first is a mindset of you're doing this work, like the platform work is because the business needs it, not because you're an engineer and you like doing this work, right? Like this is work the business needs, right? So everything you do has to be in the context. So step one was always, I have to make the best use of my engineers, right? We're hiring these, there's not a lot on the planet and we're fighting for them. And I cannot have a leaky bucket. Like I have to make sure at any point in time that my developers can get their work done, right? Okay, step one. And no one's going to argue with that. They're like, yeah, okay. Well, how do you know if they're getting work? Well, you've got to put some things in place, right? They work waiting for code reviews is the biggest thing I see is just development environment setup, right? Like how long does it take for a new developer to get their environment set up? And they're like, yeah, but we have this doc and I was like, no, like it has to be like you have to have basically a drop dead number that you never change at your company. And if it does, it opens a can of worms. And I've seen hundreds of companies, they're like, yeah, but we never, and then now it's actually 2 days and they have to do this and they've got to plug into this other thing. And it's like,
you mean for speed of dev?
Just can I get my dev environment set up and can I get a code, like some change to production? Like that, like I said, the inner and the outer, like that has to be like I think we picked 10 minutes, right? It has to be 10 minutes. Okay, bam. And then, okay, maybe it's 28 but it has to be enough and you have to keep it there every year. Okay. So that's theme number one of platform work. And it's really hard to argue against that, right? Given how much money we're all spending on engineers and how we know it's the hardest resource to get. The second point is, and this is where I think CTOs or VP of engineering have to put a bit of their product hat on, which is really understand where the product's going and promote, and again, look at all the features and go, man, we're seeing some patterns here. We're seeing some patterns and some of these patterns are more defined than others, and let's explore them. And at a certain point in time, you're gonna figure out for us to implement these well, there's some common abstractions, right? And I think that second bucket of what abstractions do we need in our platform, like new technology evolutions or abstractions that we need that are going to be hard. And as a CTO or VP engineering, you have to again understand why you're doing it. And the tool I love to use there is literally writing up a bit of like an RFC on, hey, we're going to be adding, like let's say Shopify is an example, right? Like we're going to add subscriptions to the core data model of Shopify, and we don't have to put it there. And I remember I actually wrote a draft of the RFC just because it was a big debate because it was a hard thing. But we're going to add it at this spot in the platform, and I had a team with me, and we built out a time horizon of like, if we do it this way, what are the pros and cons, and what are all the features in the next 5 years that will be able to be built off of this, right? And then so basically it was almost like a feature investment plan based on some of this platform work being done or not. And that took about 6 months of work of just like, I had one or two architects, trying to really understand it. We looked at, that was a really good dialogue, because then I was like, hey, this is value that we're going to get. Now it's going to be hard to put it in this spot, but it's the right spot. And then the third bucket is measuring those five product features that your platform enables, uptime, performance, scale, extensibility, and like maintainability. Maintainability is mostly just like looking at your support queue, and just like the inherent quality of your software. So I think that last bucket is having metrics and treating your platform as as the main accelerator of doing a really good job around those 5 product features. So for me, that's my portfolio. Like that's literally like, I like every year I'd go to my teams, and I'd obviously be working with the senior developers of my company that put a plan together that had investments in those 3 buckets. And I treated it very seriously. Like again, you have to put yourself in a mindset where you're treating this work as importantly as your CPO is treating his roadmap.
Yeah.
Right. But what I found, most engineering leaders are too blasé about this. They don't have a plan. They think the product plans and you just do. And then you end up in a spiral of making, I'd say, the wrong balance of investments. You're making good ones, but you're making the wrong balance. And over time, it's going to slow you down. So anyway, in a nutshell, sorry, I'm kind of pretty highly verbose around this, because there's been so much learned experience about like me screwing up in this area, but that's my instruction manual, I think, for making that possible and making those investments possible.
And then in terms of the people, because in the end you've had to put people in charge of it, right? And we've seen different models for that, where these platform owners, the people doing and effectively at some point the product management for the platforms, right? There's more the single-threaded owner style of things. There's, I think, more of what you did in terms of putting 2 or 3 people in the box. How did you think about who's got the platform ownership, who's driving to these 3 goals, who's making sure that developers are happily and then effectively able to contribute, and driving the retention from your first point and so on? That's another benefit, as you mentioned previously, of this.
It's hard.
How do you bring those people in, and how do you structure the actual leadership of the teams?
Yeah, my recommendation is take like 30% of your engineering team and put them in the platform bucket, just explicitly. Like just go, hey, like, and you give them some of these features, right? Like they're obviously building all the dev tools, they're building, pipelines, they're, doing a lot of the infrastructure work, like make it easy for people to spin up services, like all that fun stuff. But the reality is, a lot of the platform work you're doing are in code bases where the features are happening. Like it's not necessarily like there's just one magic API that all the abstractions go to, right? So the other work has to happen is where, as a technology leader, you're influencing the roadmaps of all the other teams around the org, right? By doing that homework, and having a really good guild of senior engineers in all these groups who, their job is to come up with the plans for their areas that fit into the 3 buckets I just talked about. Like they would, we'd bubble up and we'd share that, and they would have those tools to work with their product teams on, the things that they do. But I think having that 30% I almost call it like a platform slush fund, where I didn't all the time have to, maybe debate the 1 or 2 engineers. Like I had a bit of a, the JML slush fund of engineering stuff that I didn't have to go and necessarily convince everyone it was. And then there's another 20% where, a bit more strategic, and, we had work in different product areas of, I guess, deciding the order of what kind of work do we do. So I think that for me, that's worked really well, because it gives you a team that can be led by engineers that are, most of their customers are engineers. You have a bit of a freedom to move around without maybe some organizational complexity. But then on the flip side, keeping 20-25% of the platform roadmaps in the actual product teams forces you to be highly collaborative and explain value really well, so that they buy into it, and then they help contribute and make it better over time. I think I've had some exceptionally good PMs who, once they get it, like they get super jazzed up. And I mean, this is like, platform work's not complicated, right? Often it's just, where do we put this and why? And I've had some like amazing PMs who've been, who've really, matured their thinking about understanding how these investments pay off in the longer term, and having those throughout the org is way more valuable than having them all in one org.
Okay, yeah, I think that this makes so much sense, right? And so for that 30%, it was more engineering heavy leadership in terms of how that work was being done, and then you had more PM in the 20%.
Yep.
And okay, and then, but were you still using the 2 or 3 in a box model for the 30%, for the JML slush? 30%?
Not as much. It was probably like we had some like technical product managers in that group, like doing a lot of collaboration. Like we had like shared projects with Google Cloud doing container security models, and like so we'd have some technical product managers who'd like really help, I guess, roll out some of the platform changes across the company. Because I think a lot of the platform work success is actually adoption.
Yeah.
So it can't be built in a silo. Like it has to be built and adopted. And success is when it's been used and we're seeing value from it. So I think having some of the TPMs in those orgs have been great. And then we actually started hiring UX people in for just the UX of the tooling we're building, right? The user experience of development environment set up.
Oh, you did? Wow. That's awesome.
We had a small UX team, not great, not they were great, not big, just the user experience of using the platform. So, and one of the tools we built, which was, you're like, what kind of platform investments make sense? Is, I think the entire tech industry have spent billions of dollars on developers writing code, right? Like in IDEs and like quick fixes and running tests locally and all that stuff. But there's so little money that's gone towards what happens when you press deploy and your code's in production.
Yeah.
Like what happens, right? Or so I think we spend a lot of time at Shopify, and this was because probably a lot of history of seeing how screwed up it was and how lack of investment was. As an engineering team, you're running a bunch of things in production, right? And as an engineering organization, when I go to my GitHub repo, I see code that's stale and static and isn't running. But as an Android org, what matters more is what we're running. So we built this tool that helps us basically show everything that's running at Shopify, right? Who owns it? We actually had, quality metrics, we had uptime metrics, we had costs, right? Just really understanding the things that as engineers we think about it when our software is running, to put that into a tool so that as as your org scales, we're not just talking about the code we're writing, but we're talking about the code we're writing. And I guess that tool probably, again, like saved us, having to hire another 150 engineers.
Wow.
And right, just because and it's fascinating. We added a bit like we did in Eclipse and VS Code, like quick fixes, right? So let's say I want to create a new app at Shopify to do advanced taxes for whatever, right? Some country somewhere. You can go in, you can create an app, and you go, actually, I want a PagerDuty set up. I want this set up into Splunk, and I want a Datadog dashboard created. So what we did is we automated the development setup of the things you need to run code.
Oh, no way. That's
the same way that your IDE was doing that when they like IDE scaffold like stuff. I was like, why don't we scaffold what it takes to actually run something? And then the other thing we scaffolded was a culture of whenever you're running something in a company, everything is a different value, right? Sometimes it's an experiment, and sometimes it's a tier 1 service. So putting into this tool, going, what's our tier 1 services? And then what culture do we have around how we run those? And that's very different than tier 4. And again, that's not in GitHub. I can't see it. So we again, that was a platform investment that I think, paid off, again, we built that maybe 9 years ago. And I think kept our engineering team sane and fast over the years. But at the time, it looked like we were, had maybe not invented here syndrome but that was one of the biggest pain points is who's running what, who owns it, how do I decide what, onboard people to explaining how do we care about running things. So that was a platform investment that was like, I'm extremely like proud of, and I think is like paid off in spades.
That's amazing. Yeah, and I think Jean-Michel, just kind of the clarity with which you think and describe the different types of work and teams between the platforms, the features, the experiments, but then actually digging into the platform, and how much of this, I guess publicly, I'd seen so much of what you were doing on the platforms wasn't supposed to Shopify's own ecosystem, right? Who are building on your APIs and supporting developers, but just how much of it is actually driven by the productivity and the happiness and the success of the internal teams as well.
And you do usually hit two stones at the same time. So it's like we built this tool to help us run software. It was like because we wanted uptime to increase for customers. We wanted performance to increase for customers. And you have to build a system to do that. The same thing at Shopify. One of the biggest projects we had going was we had an API for our partner developers, and we had an API for Shopify. Right, so the UI of Shopify, like the mobile app and the web admin, was all based on an API that partners weren't using. We almost had like a partner API, and I think as we evolved the platform, we're like, it has to be the same one.
Right.
because we have to increase the quality of it because we're going to have more and more developers building on Shopify. We can't increase the quality of it if we don't use it. And we can't let our partners like find the bugs before we do.
Right.
And by the way, we're like, and we had ideas of making it better. It has to be more performant, right? So again, we moved to GraphQL, and then we're like, we're going to have one API for everyone. Yeah. So again, it's like we got a lot done with that. I'd say almost infrastructure project. Yeah. For the long term, right? Now we end up having an API that was powering our UI, our mobile apps. That was faster, and then the same one that the partners were using. We had better feedback loops, better monitoring, and that was a multi-year platform project again. That had some product input. Obviously, it made things faster and made developers faster, but it created feedback loops for the future, which it's hard to explain that on paper, why it makes sense. But I think every CTO or VP out there is like, you need a list or 2 or 3 of these. And you probably have a list of 10, and then you should strike 7 out because they're probably going to be, waste of time. So the timing's not right, but there's always a time for 1 or 2 of those things that are going to set you up for the future. And that I think your gut's going to say it's too early, and I'd say start, because you know what, it's actually easier to stop at some point than it is to start 3 years too late.
Yeah, and in the end, it is a roadmap of what you're going to productize in your platform next, right? And, exactly. And just how much internal and external benefit you can get from that. So Jean-Michel, it was to me one of the things that was so interesting about you moving into the CTO and SVP role at Shopify was you came into an even bigger organization, an even bigger code base. So I can only assume that overnight you turned everything into microservices and this beautiful architecture. But can you tell us how you really approached it? Because I think again, so many people out there working with such massive existing portfolios and code bases and under investments in platform and too much tech debt and all those kinds of things, and just I think the pragmatism of your approach, where what you've told me about thinking of how you can actually work with distributed monoliths and the like, but get to some of these platform goals. Just take us through that at a high level.
Shopify had a very decent architecture when I joined, and actually one of the things I was so excited about was it was actually pretty simple. And Toby and Cody and the team that was there, before I joined, had a couple of good values of just using a few set of technologies but being experts at it. And at that time, I described Shopify as, at that phase, was a product, like a really good product, but they kept the surface area pretty good, not overly complex. So I think what I brought to the table was really the transition from a product to a platform. And I think that's the biggest change. Okay, so we've got, we got a tax service, we have this, and they're all kind of, we haven't really, how's this going to evolve over time? And I think the first, all hands I gave it at Shopify, I was like, at that time, all the developers were writing in the same repo, right? It was on GitHub with Shopify was the thing we ran. And I was like, over time, there's a lot of things that Shopify is going to do that not all our merchants are going to need at the same time. We're going to need to build Shopify like an operating system, where we've got the kernel, and we've got a lot of applications that are built on that. And that's going to give us, one is long-term velocity, because not everything has to be in core, right? It's going to give us a great platform. It's going to help us focus on what actually is in the kernel, what's in the core, and what matters, what do we get the most leverage out. So I think that's where I spent most of my time was turning Shopify into a platform from a technology perspective, from a culture perspective, and making it more extensible, making it so that we can have a big community of developers, both within Shopify and outside, that can contribute to Shopify without all the code going to the same space, right? But I think there was a great foundation because we were simple. Shopify's architecture was simpler, and Toby and Cody made it very cloud native, which was great. And I think the speed of evolution of the architecture of Shopify was, I think we might have been one of the fastest teams on the planet Earth, right? In terms of what we've been able to do, right? Rewrote our mobile apps in React Native, introduced a new GraphQL endpoint, hyper multi-tenanted, backend distributed around the world. We're able to get, we split out, we ended up, I'd say we had a friendly monolith where our philosophy for splitting out new services was if they scaled on a different axis, then we would split it out, right? So if you look at Shopify, the back office where you log in as a merchant is very different than the online store, right? The online store is going to have 100 million visitors, and then you're going to have 20 staff. Okay, they scale differently. So we split out the online store into a rendering pipeline, into different things. And so that was kind of how we ended up, I'd say, modularizing Shopify along scaling axes, and then making it so that we can have different UIs on the same back off. So we knew we were going to have multiple mobile apps that we're going to build, right, for different functions. So that's where we ended up having a really good API and saying, you know what, there's going to be a bunch of UIs of commerce, right? There's going to be a button on your website. There's going to be a mobile app. There's going to be a shop app. Like, let's make the UI of Shopify a lot more pluggable so that we can have different commerce experiences. So that's probably the crux of what I did over like the 7 years there, was just that transition from product to platform, and then like having a couple of clear goals of why they're valuable to the business and shipping them.
Awesome. Wow. That's amazing, Jean-Michel. So tell us, we've got to start winding down here. It's so great to hear you and see you capturing these experiences in your book and your website, Building from the Right Side. So just tell us a bit about where that's headed. Please keep doing it. And thank you for sharing some of that here. And just tell us some of the kind of key things that you're now getting across to others following in your footsteps.
Well, I found that like a lot of us, again, like we're leading engineering orgs. We never took a course on this. We went to school for something completely different. Although it's related, it's actually pretty different.
It is, really.
So I think the next phase of my career is I'm helping as many, aspiring CTO, VP engineering as I can to share some like not just tips and tricks, but just ways of seeing things differently. Because I think we're not trained to see kind of patterns or see and how, I guess, large software organizations come together. So I'm writing a book called Building from the Right Side, which is inspired by a book called Drawing from the Right Side. And I did a kind of a fine arts undergrad in high school. And I think drawing forces you to look at things and look at patterns. So I'm really inspired by like having your eyes open and looking at things and putting pen to paper. So I'm writing a book that's completely free on the internet with things I've learned, and hopefully going to help everyone who's trying to do this, look at their teams, looking at tech stacks, and ask the right questions at the right time, and hopefully make it enjoyable to lead software teams.
Okay, amazing.
And have as much fun as I did,
Yeah, so we'll link the book and the website, and because I think it's such a key topic, and it's come up on the last few podcasts I've done. Just give us a little bit of a teaser. I think you talked a lot about the platform investments, but the alignment and autonomy. One of the most recent things that you've written that I think had just a massive reception out there on Twitter.
So it's a bit embarrassing because it took me forever to figure out this. But humans are trained to be autonomous, right? So in school, our job is to go away and come back and get an A+ and not talk to people about how we got there, right? Our parents are like, I can't wait till you're autonomous and you're out of the house and you fly out of the nest, right? So our entire life is about autonomy. And then people have written books to remind us. They go, hey, I talked to all these humans and they really value autonomy. And I'm like, no shit. That's what we grew up on. But then when you build a company and a team, you realize that alignment is way more important than autonomy is. And alignment is what gives you a shared language of where you're trying to go and why. And it's hard to build. It's hard to measure. Like if I ask you, Mik, are we aligned on this? You're going to go, yeah. I'm like, give me a number. Are you happy about alignment? Yeah, it's an 8 out of, I'm like, that's all BS, right? Like, no, but if I tell you, are you autonomous? Like, yeah, because my boss isn't bugging me, or like, so autonomy is this like sacred cow, and every company that values autonomy over alignment is going to die because you're going to have a company with a lack of clarity, a lack of culture of actually even discussing things at the right level. And I think we're all allergic to talking about the things that you have to get aligned on are actually a lot more in-depth than you think they are. And books are trying to, again, like get out of people's way versus why don't you should be brainstorming on things, right? And as a boss, as a leader, as a CEO, a CTO, it was really important that I get aligned with my team and that we share a set of values of how we're going to build things. And in like every project, like I would ask a lot of questions and I want my team to be asking themselves. So for me, alignment has to come way before autonomy does. But it's hard, and it's hard for me. And I value my own contribution as being the most autonomous CTO ever versus be the most aligned. And I got, I got told like time and time again by my bosses, and it took me way too long to realize this. And then I hired, like so many people that I had to have that conversation with again. I'm going, hey, we're going to be talking a lot. And I know it's not normal because you read all the books that says we're not supposed to. I'm supposed to get out of your way, but we're going to talk because what we're doing is so hard and complicated and changing that we're going to build a really close relationship of alignment. And so I think that topic is underdone. And I think, as you can tell, I'm a bit excited because it took me so long to kind of get that realization. There's so much going against us, wanting to value that. So that's the crux of my books. I'm trying to find these nuggets of things that are maybe counterintuitive. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. And it changes basically how you live and how you work with people. And hopefully, how fulfilled you can kind of feel in what you're doing.
That's awesome. That'd be another title. That'd be an amazing book in itself. That alignment greater than autonomy sign.
I know it's a big topic, but that was a 30-second
that was amazing. Jean-Michel, thank you so much. I mean, just kind of the wisdom that you've shared, and I think there's people will be listening to this over and over because there's just so much depth behind what you've done, and thank you so much for sharing it so clearly with the audience. So,
well, it was my pleasure, and thanks for teasing it out.
Awesome. Well, till the next time. Thank you so much. Thank you to Jean-Michel for taking the time to join us today. For more, follow me in my journey on LinkedIn, Twitter, or using the hashtags Mik+One or Project the Product. Jean-Michel's Twitter handle is @JMWIND, and he's got some great content and he continues posting. You can also reach out to him on LinkedIn. I have a new episode every few weeks, so hit subscribe to join us again. You can also search for Project the Product in the book, and remember that all author proceeds go to supporting women and minorities in technology. Thanks, stay safe, and until next time.